So, hello everybody. Welcome to the fifth session of the Qualitative Methods Masterclass webinar series. Let's start this series. The series of webinars is sponsored by International Institute for Qualitative Methodology, University of Alberta, and ATLAS.ti, software for qualitative data analysis. I am Neringa Kalpokaite, official instructor of ATLAS.ti, and I will just introduce a few concepts you need to know before this presentation. This presentation will be conducted through GoToWebinar, as you know, system for web conferencing. If you happen to get disconnected from this session, you have to click again on the link you received from GoToWebinar. If the presenter disconnects, she will do the same thing, but in that case, please be patient. It may take a few minutes for her to come back. Of course, we hope that none of this will happen today and everything will be okay. Today, we are happy to have with us Dr. Sally Thorne, who will present for about 30 minutes. After that, she will take questions for 10 minutes. During the presentation, your microphones will be muted in order to avoid background noise and echo. But please feel free to write down your questions and comments during the presentation using the control panel. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to read your questions and I will pass the microphone to those who want to speak. Now, I'm going to give the microphone to Amanda Schur, the Director of International Institute for Qualitative Methodology, and she will introduce today's presenter, Dr. Sally Thorne. So, Amanda, I will give the microphone to you now. Just a second. Amanda, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Neringa. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Great.
Good.
So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Sally Thorne today. Dr. Thorne is a professor at the School of Nursing and Associate Dean of the Faculty of Applied Science at the University of British Columbia. Her substantive area of research focuses on the fields of chronic illness and cancer experience and the relational aspects of health service delivery within these illness contexts. As such, her work reflects how society understands and addresses serious illness. In addition to her substantive research, she's also made extensive contributions to the methodological, theoretical, and philosophical literature of her discipline. She is the editor-in-chief of the journal Nursing Inquiry and contributes to health and health research policy through active contributions to numerous boards and organizations. She is also an active member of the IIQM Advisory Board and has contributed to numerous IIQM events, including her most recent contribution as keynote speaker at our upcoming Thinking Qualitatively workshop series being held in Edmonton at the University of Alberta this June. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Sally to start her presentation.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Now I will give the microphone to Dr. Sally Thorne, and at the same time, I'm going to make you as a presenter. Just a second to be sure that we can do that. Yes. That is Sally. Good afternoon. Oh, hello. Just a second.
Thank you, Neringa, and thank you, Amanda. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to present one of my very favorite topics, the topic of how method matters in applied qualitative research. By that I mean research directed toward a particular purpose. And I just want to express appreciation for the co-sponsorship of the International Institute of Qualitative Methodology and ATLAS.ti for this opportunity for us to gather in this particular way. This series allows a presenter to provide some personal reflections and to talk personally before going into some substantive information.
Excuse me, Sally. I'm very sorry, but I have some problems to make you as a presenter now. And if you give me just a second to be sure that we can make a change and you can show your PowerPoint presentation to everybody, give me
Not
just,
showing?
no. For instance, in my case, I have a problem to see your PowerPoint. So maybe,
Do I go off my screen? What would you suggest I do?
give me a second, just a second.
Excuse me, let me see if I can help. I am also connected. I'm going to make Sally the presenter. So I'm
Great.
going to click on your name, Sally.
Yes.
And now you should receive a message asking if you want to show your screen. And then
Yes.
you say yes. Did you get that message already?
I have it now.
Perfect.
Now
great.
it's all yours, and I will be muted, okay?
Thank you
All
very
right.
much, Ricardo. Great, let's start then. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you so much. And please do interrupt me if you're not seeing my screen properly.
Thank you.
It's my great pleasure to introduce myself and to tell you a little bit about myself, and to begin with explaining to you a little bit about how and why I became interested in this particular topic, and some of the people and experiences that have influenced me in becoming so fascinated about the question of applied qualitative research. As Amanda mentioned, I'm a nurse. I work at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and I have had some experience in the editorial work with regard to qualitative research. So I have the great privilege of reading beyond my own substantive area and to be interested in this particular field. The personal experiences that I had that have caused me to reflect over the course of 25 or 30 years about methodological questions in applied research really began with my own master's thesis. And I had the opportunity to work with a mentor, Dr. Joan Anderson, who herself had studied with Arthur Kleinman, who was at the time really the preeminent medical anthropologist studying explanatory experience of patients. So I indirectly got access to some of the very best thinking of the time. And my master's thesis was a phenomenological study, or at least that's what we were calling it, and an opportunity to kind of push the edges. It was new in my university to have qualitative research. So in that early experience, I was calling what I did phenomenology. I then evolved and worked with many colleagues, and one in particular, Dr. Jan Morse, who will be a very familiar name in qualitative health research circles. She and I had many conversations and discussions over time, and some of the research that I did over that period of time I called grounded theory. And I've just given some examples along the way. As my experiences evolved, another important mentor I worked with was Dr. Julian Lipson, who's a medical anthropologist at University of California, San Francisco, since retired, and who very much helped me to understand some of these larger questions of social construction. So I was exploring methods like ethnography at that time. Then when I went on to do my own doctoral dissertation, which was eventually published in book form, none of those methods really fit anymore, and I was really struggling with how to address the work I was doing. I was lucky enough to find the work of Lincoln and Guba in naturalistic inquiry, which allowed me to go beyond the confines of any of those methods I was working with, and was getting a little bit closer to the kind of direction that I wanted to be able to develop. But because it was developed really for educational systems and not in the health world, there were some aspects that weren't as clear as I thought I needed over time. I then, as my career evolved, had many conversations with excellent colleagues, including Dr. Margaret Sandalowski, another great thinker in this field, who pushed my thinking again and again. And I did publish a paper in those early years, early for me in the qualitative world, really challenging that question of methodological orthodoxy and why we were conforming to methods and paying some attention to that. So that's a little bit of my personal journey through some of the different methodological traditions I immersed myself in for periods of time, and some of the really wonderful thinkers I had the opportunity to have excellent debates and arguments with over time. Through all that experience, I became aware, or became convinced, that the importance of who we are and what we bring into our research question is something that had not fully been tapped in the qualitative health world. Perhaps people talk about who they are as an individual, but I was very concerned about who we are from a disciplinary perspective, what kinds of scientific questions bring us into being interested in qualitative methodology, what our training is, and certainly what our conceptual orientation is, how we think about the world in which we are trying to bring a scientific tradition to answer particular kinds of questions. My discipline, as I've said, is nursing. And although much of what I will say today will draw on nursing as an example, anybody who's listening from another discipline can certainly draw the parallels to their own discipline and reflect on what it is that the discipline brings. But I'm going to use nursing as an example to illustrate how and why I think a discipline has such a profound effect that we can capitalize on in the qualitative research that we do. And I'll give you a few examples about the thinking of nursing that guides and influences approach to qualitative research and really the understanding of how knowledge works. One is the important challenge that all nurse researchers or all nurses are dealing with on an everyday basis is the recognition that they're always thinking about the human problem in wholes and in parts. That it might be the individual body part that's presenting itself as distressed at one particular time, but we never think about that body part outside of the context of the individual who's experiencing it, their social, political, economic context, their environmental context, their hopes, dreams, aspirations, prior experiences. So the wholes are always understood in the context of the part, and we have a dialectic relationship back and forth between those in all of our conceptualizations. And that, of course, would influence our way of thinking about qualitative research. A second dimension of nursing is that nursing thought is always interested in both commonalities and differences. Obviously, we need generalized knowledge and textbook knowledge, but it is a fundamental mandate for a nurse to be bringing those general knowledges into the context of the individual patient when they're actually delivering health care. In nursing education, for example, we are not preparing nurses who think about all patients as if they're alike. In fact, we're explicitly helping them organize a framework of thinking for their practice that even if they've seen 1,000 patients that have this particular condition, their mind is oriented toward trying to figure out what is it about this next one, the 1,001st, that will be different than all others. So that moving back and forth in and out of commonalities and differences is an inherent component of what we would call excellent nursing thinking. A third aspect that I think is equally relevant is the interaction between experience and ideas. The idea that the context for coming to know what we know and the basis that upon which we know it within an applied practice discipline is always a praxis, a dialectic between the action and the reflection on action. And the thing we think of as knowledge is never really intended to be static. It's intended to be dynamic and evolving over time as we become more and more sophisticated, thoughtful, and complex in our clinical practice thinking. So the nature of knowledge for nursing, and this is entirely relevant to the qualitative enterprise, is inherently processual, systematic, flexible, and infinitely adaptive. We're not looking ever for truths or hard factual findings. Then nursing is also operating in the context, in the larger context of an evidence imperative. Evidence claims are the truth claims of our era in general, and certainly that's the case for nursing. And I think you'll see how that becomes quite relevant. the world of thinking then is a clinical epistemology that really doesn't fit itself nicely into conventional philosophical traditions of a hard material realism and or a subjectivity, but it sits somewhere in the middle of fact and intuition, of objectivity and subjectivity, and we're concerned about things like pattern recognition and infinite variation on pattern. So it would be understandable why quantitative knowledge alone was never really satisfying to nursing, and why there would be a pull toward qualitative knowledge. So when the numbers didn't fit, we looked to qualitative methods that were available, and had some very strong affinities for the three major ones that I've mentioned before. And each of them, it's important to recognize, comes from a particular social scientific tradition that has its own structure and purpose and reason for being. Each of the social sciences exists to solve a certain kind of intellectual problem on behalf of society. They don't exist for the purposes of the applied disciplines, but they exist in their own right, and therefore their methodological traditions, of course, have evolved from those. So these were legitimate traditions that nursing borrowed on, and to some extent that they were satisfying, but nursing also confronted considerable resistance in the context in which it was trying to express qualitative research as a legitimate scientific enterprise. The health science community at the time was not particularly comfortable with this new way of thinking about science. The arguments that early researchers had to make were very much justifying that this was something that was reasonable to do. So there was pushback in that regard. But increasingly, there was also pushback from social science colleagues, because those of us in the applied health world were not fully committed social scientists. We had this applied nudge going on all of the time in our minds. So researchers in the qualitative health world began to run into difficulty with grant reviewers and journal editors. Others from the social sciences in particular who would say it's a little bit like grounded theory, but it's not fully sociology. Or from the health science community would say it's an interesting thing to do, but I don't think it's science. So we really were confronting a lot of resistance and trying to thinking about this as paradigmatic thinking. In other words, you don't understand this kind of research until you're in it. But it created quite a difficulty sorting through what is the nature of the enterprise in qualitative health research. This led to, I think, a real attachment to being just slavish in adhering to a method. There was this feeling of safety that if you had a written method that came from the social sciences and you followed it religiously, then you could defend your study a little bit more effectively. And perhaps there was some comfort from that. But it led to a whole culture of rule alignment where we were really thinking about the caliber of research as being something we evaluated more on the basis of its tightness to method than to the quality of the new knowledge that it was generating for us. Many in the health research world will be familiar with the work of Margaret Sandlowski, who has written many very highly cited papers. But in 1986, she had written an original paper about the problem of rigor in qualitative research. And this is among the most highly cited papers in the qualitative health research world. However, I think she later came to feel that she'd become part of the problem in encouraging people to adhere rigorously to a conventional methodology. So, like the best of scientists, she wrote a second paper challenging the original paper she'd written and really encouraging people to think beyond that adherence to method. And so I think there were many people really realizing that being methodologically tight according to a tradition that didn't quite fit in the applied world was creating a new form of problem. And I want to talk a little bit and give you some examples of the specific sorts of problems that some of the conventional ideas from the conventional qualitative methods were causing in qualitative health research, specifically for those of us in nursing. A first example is the idea of the entree, coming into research as if nothing is known, which is a very proud and well-established phenomenological tradition for very good reasons in the study of certain phenomenological problems. However, in the health world, it becomes a really flawed argument to claim that you're studying something because nothing is known. About most things, there may not have been a qualitative study previously, but there will be clinical wisdom, and your very reason in an applied discipline for wanting to study something ought to be that the failure to understand it has become a clinical problem. So to pretend, as it were, that you had no prior knowledge really suggested you were studying something in a field that wasn't really related to your practice discipline. And if in fact your practice discipline had brought you to a question, then there is a lot that's known. Now that's not to say that you might not suspend judgment about things you've assumed, which is a totally different exercise. But the convention that you study because nothing is known and that you legitimize not going into the literature before you begin your study does not quite work in the health world. Another of these is the narrative imperative, the idea that people who tell you something in a qualitative study, particularly an interview study, are speaking a truth. Well, it's not that they're not speaking a truth, but what we know about narrative and what we know about human report and what we know about human behavior tells us a great deal about narrative being a particular form of expression, but not necessarily a truth. Certainly the things that patients tell us about what happened in their healthcare experience is not necessarily a truthful claim about what actually happened. And in fact, we can't make any claims about knowing that what actually happened. What we can make claims about is knowing that they report. What we also know, though, in the context of people's movement over time and their reframing of experience depending on social construction, is that for many of us, the way in which we would tell our experience shifts over time and context. So that aspect of the dynamic fluidity of experience over time is something that would always be important in a qualitative study. Not taking the words of somebody today literally as if that's the truth for all time, but recognizing it's the report that you're being given today. A third is the idea that data speak for themselves, and many of you will have heard that expression or something like it in presentations of qualitative research, where simply a selection of data would be used as if to convey a point. And while the data, a wonderful, beautiful, gorgeous piece of data may well convey a message, it is important to always recognize that it's you, the researcher, who acquired it and who selected it and who's chosen to present it. So there's a tremendous amount of conceptual manipulation going on in bringing it to the point of display. And it isn't really the data that are speaking for themselves in a context such as that. Another aspect of research, because of the reflection on thinking and the reflection on the individual as instrument of research, many qualitative health researchers have mistaken that for assuming that the study is really about their particular journey in thinking, rather than recognizing that it's useful to reflect on your journey in thinking in order to understand the phenomenon that you're studying. But in the applied health world, coming as a nurse into a study, my job would be to make sure I get myself out of the way, not take over center stage as the most exciting thing about a piece of research. So those issues of how we locate ourselves individually can become a confusion and a challenge. Another is the primacy of abstraction. Many qualitative research conventional methods would use the idea of an overarching metaphor as the vision that you're aiming for in research, that things that are metaphorically represented have a coherence and a conceptual integrity that's at a higher level than are things that are merely descriptively reported. However, when we're studying things from a clinical perspective in the health field, an abstraction is only going to be useful, a metaphor is only going to be useful if it actually answers some questions, if it really tells us something that we can't be told in other ways. So very often, health researchers have made the mistake of assuming that they're seeking a metaphor rather than answering questions. And we have metaphoric presentations of data that look like butterflies or bridges or tapestries or flowers, something that is whimsical and actually takes us away from scientific credibility rather than being useful. A final one, or another one that I think is particularly relevant to nursing, is the notion of theoretical saturation as the convenient exit from data collection. This is very widely used, and some form of it is often used in grant proposals and in writing up of research to explain sample size. Sample size in qualitative research is a very complicated operation, and how on earth you would ever make the claim that you know everything you can know is really very tricky. The idea comes from a very solid tradition in grounded theory in relation to a particular level of theorizing and a very in-depth kind of operation one does in order to determine whether there could possibly be other cases. It does that in relation to basic social processes, so it actually makes tremendous sense in the traditional sociological context. In the health world, such as nursing, it doesn't make sense to be able to say, I've interviewed 20 patients and therefore I can confidently say that there aren't any further theoretical versions of this or theoretical variations that I might see. So this is an example of a disjuncture between the disciplinary orientation and the way people may take up method. Another is the ideas of what it is that constitutes truth. We all know a great qualitative study can be very evocative, and an excellent presenter can bring us to tears and make us really feel the emotion and sympathize with the suffering of patients, for example. But the bringing us to tears is not the truth measure. The other unfortunate truth claim measure that some individuals seem to build in is the member check. If people who you studied think you understand their experience very well, then that necessarily means that it is truthful. It may, for example, reflect the choice that you made in representing the findings in a way that was most pleasing to the study you're sampling, but not necessarily the most useful or whole representation. So these are some interesting versions. Finally, and one that is really quite important, is the role of theory in applied qualitative research. Theory is incredibly integral to all of qualitative research in the social sciences because of the primacy of theory as a motivation of the intellectual projects of those sciences. The role in applied research in the health field, for example, is really quite different, and I think there are some very strong epistemological differences between social science and health sciences. Specifically, social sciences exist to discover laws and principles and human universals, and the applied sciences, such as health, to solve health problems. I'm fully aware that those are simplistic and complete overgeneralizations, but I think it's a useful distinction to help us keep in mind why certain very good technique that works well in a social science discipline might not work very well in the applied world, such as health. Theory in qualitative research privileges certain kinds of analyses, and it also obscures others. And it's always important to remember that. The fallout of borrowed theory tradition is that we can very often go into a qualitative health study but lose our disciplinary grip. We can find ourselves studying and adding on to the theoretical direction rather than the phenomena that we were seeking to study. And by borrowing some of these understandings about using theory from the social sciences to the health sciences, we can very much lose that disciplinary grip. We can find ourselves manipulating language signifiers, using terms loosely without really understanding or without using them in the conventional term in which they're intended, and therefore actually discrediting the field with what looks to others like fuzziness and irrelevance. So this is the context into which there's a new generation of thinking in the applied fields that's attempting to emancipate qualitative methodology from its social science traditions. The aim of this is really to venture beyond describing and theorizing and to try and bring an angle of a clinical angle of vision into the evidence-based context using qualitative methodology as the tool to counter those limits of conventional science that we all recognize, to capture experiential phenomena where they're relevant to our understanding, to expose patterns in complex experience, categorize commonalities and variations, and to really help us expand that critical reflection that we have on the context in which phenomena happen. The context, for example, in which people experience health and illness. So from my perspective, the explicit contributions of applied qualitative science are that it now prepares us and gives us tools to be able to examine that which conventional science either misses or misunderstands, that which gets stuck between the numbers, the white spaces between the numbers, the things that obscured when you try and quantify it, those things that behave in ways that can't be regularized and captured in numeric form, and also those aspects of human experience that change outside of the context of its natural complexity. So these are all some very important additional contributions and relevant contributions that qualitative research can make in that applied world. There are lots of people working on many different aspects of applied methodology, and I think this really is a new generation of thinking in qualitative research. Some have written books, some have written articles, and there's lots of different language being used to describe the traditions that people are working with. The one I've been working with is called Interpretive Description, which was the most neutral term we could think of at the time that we were first writing about it, recognizing that we do describe, but from a nursing point of view, it's never satisfying to simply describe. You always want to go that one step further to say, what does it mean? What can I do with this information? And why is it important? So interpretive description is actually derived from a nursing epistemology, from that way of thinking that nursing is so embedded in. It also shamelessly borrows the best of technique from the conventional social science world without taking along some of the theoretical baggage. It uses theory as a tool and not as the ultimate purpose of qualitative research. And what I and others are trying to do, which is such an exciting thing these days, is to really think about how to use strategic design logic in qualitative studies toward intelligent science within our particular projects and disciplines. And when we do this, we really believe that qualitative research can become a really constructive corrective to those inherent limits of measurement and generalization. I think we all understand that there are limits, and that conversation continues. Many of our colleagues in the quantitative world are quite aware of those limitations, but not necessarily understanding what to do with them. And we, in conversation with them, can come up with some of those answers. Qualitative research can also fill the gaps, those things that can't be studied or fall between the items or measures. It can very much illuminate phenomena that need to be brought into the light to be seen differently, to be examined in closer detail. A particularly wonderful aspect of contribution that qualitative research can make is to illuminate and interpret variance. We can recognize that a phenomenon will be shown in many, many different formats, but what we want to do is orient the mind of the clinician to be able to understand what to do with those variations, how to see variation, and how to interpret those variations. So while qualitative research wouldn't attempt to be capturing them all, it can be giving some examples of how variations look that stimulate the clinical imagination to be thinking in an optimal way in the practice world, and not simply standardizing people in clinical practice. Used this way, qualitative research can also challenge the assumptions that we come to believe because they have been so solidly measured in the world. Those things that are strongly measured tend to become pretty hardcore facts over time, and sometimes they do need a challenge that qualitative research can certainly be designed to generate. We all recognize as well that, of course, it's a wonderful humanizer. The numbers will tell one story, and the human story, the narrative, will evoke another, and together they can create a really thoughtful understanding. So as we move forward, we're really thinking not just of theorizing as the purpose of qualitative research, and we're not anymore fighting for a higher position on the evidence hierarchy. We're certainly never going to win that particular argument. But collectively, as we work with applied method, we're trying to move toward an integration and synthesis and application of knowledge so that it solves the very important problems of our discipline. So that's what excites me in the world of applied qualitative research. And I've given a very fast overview of 25 years or so of my thinking, but I'd like to stop now and see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Sally, for this amazing presentation. I really personally have enjoyed very much. Now, all of you, dear participants, you have a great opportunity to ask to Dr. Sally Thorne your questions. If you are interested to ask some questions to Dr. Sally, you just have to click on the hand icon on the control panel, and I will give you the microphone. Or also, you can just write your question in the control panel, and I will read it. Okay, I see that. Just a second. Okay, Lisa, I see that you have a question to Dr. Sally Thorne. I will look for you, and I will give the microphone for you. Elisa, can you hear us?
I can hear you, yeah.
Perfect. So, would you like to ask your question to Dr. Sally Thorne?
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I really speaks to me right now with where I'm thinking, but you've probably been familiar with Indigenous research methodologies coming from education, and I'm trying to use it within a nursing frame context. So the descriptive interpretive really falls nicely into the Indigenous philosophies perspective. One of my struggles is putting it into this continuum of qualitative, quantitative. I know the Indigenous scholars that I work with say it's neither one, or it's both of them. So I'm trying to develop an argument as to, geez, I don't even know. I'm sorry, I can't articulate this clearly. But I think it lends itself, it enhances qualitative. I think one of the contributions of IRM to qualitative study is its ability to show the strength of it, because from an Indigenous approach, there's all those perspectives that we bring in, like grounded theory, phenomenology, interpretive. Am I making any sense?
Thank you very much, Lisa. Let's give the microphone to Dr. Sally. Just a second. Here you are. Dr. Sally, the microphone is yours.
I may not have been able to catch all of your question, but I certainly heard the wonderful dilemma that you're in with regard to not only working among and between qualitative methods, but also being able to think about that incredibly interesting problem of mixed methods. I'm not sure that I can answer everything that you've posed in your question, but the comment that I really would like to make is I think we are moving very far beyond what it looked like when I began, in which we were totally stuck in one paradigm or another. Something was either qualitative or quantitative, and never the two should be in the same conversation, let alone the same study. I've become less and less convinced over time that that it's useful to think about them as paradigmatically different. I think there's a tremendous range within quantitative research with regard to what is trying to pull itself out of human experience and dynamic context, and what's trying to stay connected with that. I also do see a tremendous range within qualitative studies, with those that are attempting to descriptively and evocatively do what we might have thought of as descriptive quantitative research, just a kind of a content analysis, should we say, with more evocative description. And those are still a form of qualitative or on the edge, but very different than the full range of the more metaphoric kinds of studies. Because of the problem that you've raised, and I think that, well, I haven't an answer. I think you explained it very thoughtfully. I do believe that the interesting problem is to be focusing on what's the nature of the knowledge that you need, and why do you need it, and therefore what pieces of design are going to get you there. The reason that we developed the book, the thinking and the writing on interpretive description, was to give a design logic to people such as yourself who did not find that they fit into a tradition that was being offered to them, that the thing they wanted to study and the way they thought they ought to study it was not quite fitting. And the method is not intended to compete with other methods, but for people such as yourself, to be able to help them think through a line of reasoning, one step after another, that can create a credible, logical trail of knowledge development from beginning to end of a study. And I don't care whether anybody cites the work or uses the language of interpretive description. What I'm really excited about is the invitation to be able to think that through. When I began doing qualitative research, it would have been heresy to think that a graduate student, for example, could be deciding on their own methodological choices. It was much safer to draw on what one of the experts had written. And yet I saw many, many graduate students at all levels who really were making excellent design modifications, not just for eclectic reasons or laziness or sloppiness, but because that really was more consistent with the nature of the knowledge that was needed to solve the problem that had caused them to come into the study. So I think that it sounds like you're somebody who's also wrestling with these ideas, and I'm really excited about these conversations continuing. I think many people are trying to create the kind of knowledge base in which individuals can actually use qualitative technique to solve applied problems. Not that people will learn to be a phenomenologist or to be a grounded theorist or to be an ethnographer. Hope that helps.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sally. I have more questions. Another question we have from Lorraine. Lorraine, I will give you the microphone. Where are you? Just a second. The microphone, Lorraine, is yours. Lorraine, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, sure. I had typed it out, but a few slides back, one of your points was about not bringing the theoretical baggage from the social sciences into applied qualitative research. So taking some of the good stuff, but leaving some of the theoretical baggage behind, I think, or something like that. And I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Thank you. I will give the microphone to you, Sally. Here you are. The microphone is yours.
Thank you. That's a great question. I appreciate the opportunity to explain that a little bit further. In the applied health research world, it's fairly common for people to believe that they need a theoretical framework, and so that they go and find somebody's theory and write about it at the beginning of their proposal. Sometimes that completely disappears. After the beginning, they've indicated somebody's theory, but it goes away, and we never really hear about it till the end of the study, and maybe or maybe not it appears. So often it's simply included because you think you need to have one. The other extreme is when you have identified a theoretical framework, but the study really becomes a study about that framework rather than about the phenomenon that you were taking the framework in order to develop. So those are two extreme conditions, but I think what they illustrate is that there's such a huge diversity of how people use theory. I'll give you one example. In the health field, that it's quite common to use critical feminist methodology or critical social theory in the development of research, because people are trying to answer questions about why is this happening to people, what social forces are at play to create health inequities and things like that. The challenge is that while these theoretical approaches are really useful in informing the question, if they start to dominate the study, then they can really predetermine the answers. If you take a strict feminist approach into a health study, you will always find that the whole thing is about power imbalances, gender-based power imbalances. And it's not that they're not relevant, it's just that it isn't actually an interesting finding to find them if you started your study with the assumption that that was the dominant driver. So these are some of the ways in which theory can actually complicate and obscure a study. And because of this, so many health researchers have really wrestled with it. And when we read health research, we see a lot of uses and misuses of theoretical claims. We also have the problem of people at the end of a study, say a smaller, fairly descriptive qualitative study, a thematic analysis or something like that. People sometimes believe that what they have come up with in their findings is actually a theory, and they refer to it as a theory. It may be very half-baked and underdeveloped, but I think actually what they're borrowing is an assumption from the social sciences that the outcome of the research is a theory. So these are some of the problems. I think they tend to discredit the work that we do. They tend to make it difficult for other people to read it and know what to do with it. It creates a confusing message that is not as strong as a piece of qualitative research whose design logic from beginning to end is really credible and convincing toward the problem you were trying to solve. So thanks very much for that really excellent question. And I think it's a fascinating topic of how we use and abuse theory.
Thank you for you, Dr. Sally. We have the last but not the least question from Mary. If you never mind, I will give the microphone to Mary to ask the last question. Mary, would you like to ask the question?
Thank you very much, Dr. Sally Thorne. I really had a great time of listening to you. I'm pretty much new to interpretive descriptive inquiry, so I will be happy to hear you briefly highlight on if there are any philosophical underpinnings of this kind of methodology. I'll be grateful if you can highlight on that. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that question. Interpretive description, we sometimes say it's both a method and not a method. If you need to have a method named and you want to do a good design logic, then it's perfectly acceptable to reference it as the name of the method you're using. However, I don't have any particular need for everybody to be calling their work interpretive description. That's not the point at all. If you were doing a phenomenological piece of research, but you found that you needed to inform it differently, such as you might decide you do draw from phenomenological technique, but you really ground it solidly in the literature beforehand, you might use interpretive description as a justification. The logic of interpretive description could help you justify that design modification that you were making. And so it has been offered to the applied research world to be used as it is necessary. The book itself really goes through the steps of research and helps people think about the kinds of choices they might want to make and the kinds of rationale they might want to use for their sample size or their data, the data collection technique or their analytic tradition or any aspect of the design. So it's really not prescriptive in the sense of saying do it this way, but opening up an invitation to really thoughtful, logical research And in my mind, because I am in a discipline and I really believe strongly in the thinking of that discipline, I actually think disciplinary knowledge is a theoretical framework that we ought to be using much more emphatically in guiding our research. So in contrast to the earlier question, when I was talking about the uses and abuses of theory, I think celebrating the particularly interesting logic that our applied disciplines bring to us and trying to work out what methodological choices they seem to favor is what I'm really very interested in. And I think that people do need to have citations and references and a good logical grounding in order to explain and defend anything that doesn't look like a conventional method. So interpretive description is being offered in that way as well. So I hope that doesn't confuse the issue totally. It's a method and not a method, but the whole point of it all is to really encourage people to become as clear and logical as they can be in creating a qualitative research design that creates a very satisfying answer to the problem that they want to solve.
Thank you very much, Sally, for all your presentation. I'm sure that all of us, we have enjoyed very much your presentation and your ideas. Now I would like to give the microphone to Amanda Schroer, the Director of International Institute for Qualitative Methodology, just to make some announcements, and then I will make some announcements also. So, dear Amanda, would you like to take the microphone? The microphone is yours, Amanda.
Thank you, Naringa, and thank you, Sally, so much for your wonderful presentation. Sally put up a slide there so you can see on your screen. Our next webinar will be on June 27th, and that's with Dr. Sarah Pink. And just a reminder that on our website, all of the previous webinars that have been recorded are posted on there. So if you go to www.iiqm.ualberta.ca, you can see all of the previous webinars. As well, you can see some information about our upcoming events. IIQM is hosting two fantastic events in June here at the University of Alberta campus. The first is the Thinking Qualitatively workshop series, and that's a 4-day intensive workshops, hands-on workshops on qualitative methods. Topics include grounded theory, interpretive description, phenomenology, ethnography, and many, many more. Dr. Sally Thorne will be our keynote, and she'll also be giving a half-day workshop on interpretive description. And then right after TQ, we have the Advances in Qualitative Methods Conference. So the dates for those are June 17th to 23rd. And I just want to remind everyone that the early bird registration deadline is May 16th. So that's coming up quick. If you're interested in either or both of those events, please visit our website and register before the 16th of May. Again, the website is www.iiqm.ualberta.ca. And that's it. Thanks, Naringa.
So I would like to comment that if anybody would like to learn ATLAS.ti, we offer every week free webinars. So you can go on the website and learn more about that. Also, I wanted to comment that we will send you an evaluation form, and we will send you the link where you will find the video recorded and the PowerPoint of today's presentation. Dr. Sally, would you like to say goodbye? I just will give the microphone to say goodbye, or maybe some few more things would you like to say before goodbye?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about a topic I'm obviously passionately enthusiastic about, and I really appreciate all of you who chose to take time out of your busy schedules today to listen.
Thank you very much, Sally. So I want to say thank you all for participating in this webinar. As I said earlier, this is the 5th session, and as Amanda mentioned, the next webinar will take place on 27th of June, and it's really very important your participation to make the series successful. So we look forward to seeing all of you in our future events for this webinar series. Thank you all and goodbye. Thank you.
Neringa, ¿te puedes quedar unos minutos? Can you stay a few minutes?
Yes, here I am.
Yes. Okay, let's wait for people to disconnect.
Okay.
Or let me see. Amanda, are you there? Okay, she's disconnected. That's fine.